In 157 years of the Medal of Honor's existence, only one woman has ever received America's highest military decoration, and they tried to take it away from her. Because Dr. Mary Edwards Walker didn't just break barriers, she shattered them, serving as a Civil War surgeon in a world that said women belonged in the kitchen, not on the battlefield. Welcome to Untold Heroes Stories. Which state are you watching from? We'd love to hear your military stories in the comments. The Medal of Honor stories told on this channel are completely true. Sources are in the description. Now, let's continue. Mary Edwards Walker was born on November 26, 1832, on a farm in Oswego, New York, to parents who were radical for their time. Alva and Vesta Walker believed in education for all their children, including their daughters. This was revolutionary thinking in the 1830s, when most girls were taught only domestic skills and considered the property of their fathers and later their husbands. The Walker family operated their farm as equals. Mary worked alongside her brothers in the fields, learning that hard work and determination had no gender. Her parents dressed their daughters in practical clothing, bloomers and short skirts that allowed freedom of movement rather than the restrictive corsets and floor-length dresses that Victorian society demanded women wear. From an early age, Mary displayed an insatiable curiosity about the human body and medicine. While other girls played with dolls, Mary dissected dead animals she found on the farm, trying to understand how life worked. Her parents, instead of discouraging this behavior, supported her unusual interests. In 1855, at the age of 23, Mary graduated from Syracuse Medical College, one of only a handful of women in the entire country to earn a medical degree. The achievement was remarkable not just for its rarity, but for the hostility she faced. Male students and professors ridiculed her presence, claiming that women lacked the intellectual capacity for medicine and that studying anatomy was immoral for the weaker sex. But Mary persevered. She graduated with honors and immediately set up a medical practice in Columbus, New York. However, the reality of being a female doctor in the 1850s was harsh. Patients refused to see her, believing that women couldn't possibly understand medicine as well as men. Other doctors shunned her, and she struggled financially. In 1856, Mary married Albert Miller, also a physician. But even this relationship challenged social norms. Mary refused to take her husband's name, to promise to obey him in her marriage vows, or to wear a traditional wedding dress. Instead, she wore a modified version of men's formal wear, complete with trousers. The scandal this created in their small town was enormous. The marriage lasted only a few years. Albert had affairs, which Mary discovered and found intolerable. In an era when divorce was almost impossible for women to obtain and carried tremendous social stigma, Mary filed for divorce anyway, another act of defiance against societal expectations. But it was the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 that would define Mary Edwards Walker's legacy and change American history. When the war began, Mary immediately volunteered her services as a surgeon to the Union Army. The response was swift and crushing. The Army rejected her application. Women, they explained, were not suitable for military service in any capacity. The battlefield was no place for the gentler sex. Undeterred, Mary traveled to Washington, D.C. at her own expense and began working as an unpaid volunteer at the Patent Office Hospital. She treated wounded soldiers, observed battlefield injuries, and quickly realized that military medicine was woefully inadequate. Army surgeons were often poorly trained, sanitation was virtually non-existent, and more soldiers were dying from disease and infection than from battlefield wounds. Mary's medical training had included the latest theories about antisepsis and hygiene, knowledge that most military surgeons lacked. She began implementing cleaning protocols and sterile techniques that dramatically reduced infection rates among her patients. Word of her success began to spread through the medical community. For nearly 3 years, Mary worked without official recognition or pay, treating soldiers and refining her surgical techniques. She dressed practically in modified men's clothing that allowed her to move freely around hospitals and battlefields, a choice that drew constant criticism and even arrests for impersonating a man. In 1863, the situation became so desperate that military officials finally began to consider Mary's repeated requests for official appointment. The Union Army was hemorrhaging trained medical personnel, and Mary had proven her competence repeatedly. Dr. George Cooper, an Army surgeon who had observed her work, wrote to military command, Dr. Walker possesses surgical skills superior to many of our commissioned surgeons and has demonstrated courage under fire that exceeds most men. On September 15, 1863, Mary Edwards Walker received her commission as acting assistant surgeon for the Union Army. the first woman ever officially appointed to serve as a military surgeon. Her salary was set at $100 per month, significantly less than male surgeons of equivalent rank, but Mary didn't care. She had achieved what everyone said was impossible. Mary was assigned to the 52nd Ohio Infantry Regiment, operating near the front lines in Tennessee and Georgia. Almost immediately, she distinguished herself not just as a skilled surgeon, but as someone willing to go where other medical personnel wouldn't. Unlike many military surgeons who remained safely behind the lines, Mary regularly ventured into active combat zones to treat wounded soldiers. She would crawl across battlefields under enemy fire to reach injured men, perform emergency surgery in bombed-out buildings, and evacuate casualties from positions so dangerous that stretcher bearers refused to go there. Her fellow soldiers, initially skeptical of having a woman surgeon, quickly came to respect and admire her. She treated Confederate and Union soldiers with equal care, often working 18-hour days without rest. Her medical kit became legendary. She carried surgical instruments, medications, and supplies that she had purchased with her own money when military supplies ran short. But Mary's service extended beyond medicine. She began gathering intelligence for the Union Army, using her medical missions as cover to observe Confederate troop movements and fortifications. Confederate soldiers, unused to seeing women on battlefield, often assumed she was a harmless civilian and spoke freely around her. On April 10, 1864, while conducting a medical mission near Atlanta, Georgia, Mary was captured by Confederate forces. The circumstances of her capture revealed the full scope of her courage and the danger she regularly faced. Mary had received word that Union soldiers were trapped and wounded in a farmhouse behind Confederate lines. Despite knowing the extreme risk, she volunteered to attempt a rescue mission. Carrying only her medical supplies and wearing her distinctive modified uniform, she crossed enemy lines under cover of darkness. She successfully reached the wounded soldiers and was treating their injuries when Confederate cavalry surrounded the farmhouse. Rather than abandoning her patients, Mary continued working until Confederate soldiers burst through the door. "What are you doing here?" demanded the Confederate captain. "I'm a surgeon treating wounded men," Mary replied calmly. "These soldiers need medical attention regardless of which uniform they wear." The Confederate officers were baffled. They had never encountered a woman in military service, and Mary's presence challenged everything they understood about warfare and gender role. Some argued she should be released as a civilian. Others insisted she was a spy who should be executed. After hours of debate, Confederate command decided to treat Mary as a prisoner of war, making her the first woman ever to receive this designation. She was transported to Castle Thunder Prison in Richmond, Virginia, where she would spend the next 4 months in captivity. Prison conditions at Castle Thunder were notoriously harsh. Prisoners received minimal food, no medical care, and lived in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions designed to break their spirit. But Mary refused to be broken. Even in prison, she continued practicing medicine. She treated fellow prisoners with whatever supplies she could obtain, nursed sick guards, and maintained detailed notes about prison conditions that would later help improve prisoner treatment. She also continued wearing her modified uniform, despite Confederate attempts to force her into traditional women's clothing. "I would rather die in the attire of my own choosing than live in the costume you would force upon me," she told her captors. Mary's imprisonment became an international incident. Union officials demanded her release, arguing that she was a non-combatant medical officer. Confederate officials struggled with how to handle a prisoner who challenged every assumption about gender and warfare. On August 12, 1864, Mary was released in a prisoner exchange, the only woman included in the formal military exchange process. She immediately returned to duty, despite advice from friends and family to retire from military service. The final year of the war saw Mary's most dangerous and heroic service. She was assigned to areas of intense fighting, including the battles around Atlanta and the March to the Sea. Her willingness to treat wounded soldiers under fire became legendary throughout the Union Army. At the Battle of Atlanta, Mary performed surgery in a partially destroyed church while Confederate artillery shells exploded around the building. She continued operating even when shrapnel shattered windows and debris fell from the ceiling. When other medical personnel fled, Mary remained with her patients. "Someone has to stay with the wounded," she explained to a fellow surgeon who urged her to seek shelter. "If we abandon them, who will save them?" During Sherman's March to the Sea, Mary often worked alone, moving between scattered units to provide medical care. She would ride for hours through hostile territory, carrying surgical supplies and medicines to soldiers who otherwise would have received no medical attention. One of her most remarkable achievements during this period was establishing field protocols for treating battlefield trauma that would influence military medicine for decades. Mary pioneered techniques for rapid wound cleaning, emergency amputation procedures, and shock treatment that saved thousands of lives. When the war ended in April 1865, Mary had served for nearly 4 years, much of it in active combat zone. She had performed hundreds of surgeries, treated thousands of wounded soldiers, survived imprisonment, and proven that women could serve effectively in military roles previously thought impossible. But recognition for her service would prove as challenging as the service itself. On November 11, 1865, President Andrew Johnson awarded Mary Edwards Walker the Medal of Honor. The citation read, "Whereas it appears from official reports that Dr. Mary E. Walker, a graduate of medicine, has rendered valuable service to the government, and her efforts have been earnest and untiring in a variety of ways, and that she was assigned to duty and served as an assistant surgeon in charge of female prisoners at Louisville, Kentucky, upon the recommendation of Major Generals Sherman and Thomas, and faithfully served as contract surgeon in the service of the United States, and has devoted herself with much patriotic zeal to the sick and wounded soldiers, both in the field and hospitals, to the detriment of her own health, and has also endured hardships as a prisoner of war 4 months in a southern prison while acting as contract surgeon. And whereas by reason of her not being a commissioned officer in the military service, a brevet or honorary rank cannot, under existing laws, be conferred upon her. And whereas in the opinion of the President, an honorable recognition of her services and sufferings should be made. Now, therefore, be it known that there is hereby granted to Dr. Mary E. Walker the thanks of the President for her valuable services during the rebellion, and that, as a token of the high appreciation in which they are held, there is hereby tendered to her a testimonial thereof." Mary was the first and, to this day, only woman to receive the Medal of Honor. However, her struggles with recognition were far from over. In 1917, 52 years after receiving her medal, the Army decided to review Medal of Honor recipients and revoked 911 awards, including Mary's. The review board claimed that many recipients, particularly civilians and contract personnel, didn't meet new standards for military heroism. Mary was outraged. At 85 years old, she wrote fierce letters to Congress, the War Department, and newspapers, demanding her medal be restored. "You can have it over my dead body," she declared when officials tried to reclaim the physical medal. The controversy reflected broader societal resistance to acknowledging women's contributions to military service. Many in the military establishment remained uncomfortable with the idea that a woman had received their highest honor, regardless of her demonstrated courage and service. Mary wore her Medal of Honor every day for the rest of her life. Despite official revocation, she appeared in parades, gave speeches about women's rights, and continued advocating for gender equality until her death. Mary Edwards Walker died on February 21, 1919, at the age of 86. She was buried in the dress uniform she had worn during the Civil War, with her Medal of Honor prominently displayed. Her tombstone reads simply, "Dr. Mary Walker, the only woman Medal of Honor winner." For 58 years, Mary's Medal of Honor remained officially revoked. But in 1977, after decades of advocacy by historians and women's rights activists, President Jimmy Carter and the Army Board for Correction of Military Records officially restored her medal. The restoration came with a powerful statement: "Dr. Mary Edwards Walker's distinguished record of service during the Civil War merits special recognition. Her courage and dedication in providing medical care to Union soldiers, often under dangerous conditions, exemplify the highest traditions of military service." Today, Mary Edwards Walker's legacy extends far beyond her Medal of Honor. She was a pioneer in women's rights, dress reform, and military medicine, whose influence shaped American society for generations. Her insistence on wearing practical clothing instead of restrictive Victorian dresses helped launch the dress reform movement that eventually gave women the freedom to wear comfortable, functional clothing. Her medical innovations influenced battlefield treatment protocols still used today. Most importantly, Mary proved that courage, competence, and dedication to service have no gender. She opened doors for women in medicine, military service, and public life that had previously been sealed shut. The Mary Edwards Walker Education Center at the Army Medical Center continues her legacy by training military medical personnel in trauma care and emergency surgery. Her techniques for treating battlefield injuries remain part of military medical curriculum. But perhaps Mary's greatest achievement was simpler and more profound. She refused to accept limitations that others tried to place on her because of her gender. When society said women couldn't be doctors, she became one anyway. When the army said women couldn't serve in combat, she served anyway. When authorities tried to take away her Medal of Honor, she kept it anyway. Mary Edwards. Walker's story reminds us that progress often comes from individuals who refuse to accept the word impossible. She didn't break barriers gradually or politely, she shattered them completely, proving that the only real limitations are the ones we accept for ourselves. In an era when women's military service continues to evolve and expand, Mary Edwards Walker remains the gold standard for courage under fire and dedication to service above self. She earned her Medal of Honor not because she was a woman serving in a man's world, but because she was a patriot who served her country with extraordinary valor when it needed her most. Today, when young women enter military service as combat medics, surgeons, and officers, they follow a path that Mary Edwards Walker carved out through sheer determination and courage. She proved that heroism has no gender, and that sometimes the most qualified person for the job is the one everyone says can't do it. Dr. Mary Edwards Walker remains the only woman to receive the Medal of Honor because she was willing to do what no woman had done before. And in doing so, she showed that women could do anything that courage and competence required.